The ocean doesn't warn you. That's the first thing anyone who has ever worked on the water will tell you. It doesn't send a letter. It doesn't knock on your door. One moment the world is cold and gray and ordinary, and the next moment, everything you thought you knew about your own survival is gone. Caleb Marsh was 19 years old the morning the Irene Marie went down. He wasn't supposed to be on that boat. That's what made it harder. Later, when people tried to piece together how it happened, Caleb had originally signed on for a 2-week salmon run out of Kodiak, Alaska, a short trip, decent pay, nothing unusual. But when the crew of the Irene Marie lost a deckhand to a broken wrist the night before departure, the dock foreman pointed at Caleb and said 4 words that would change his life forever. You're going instead. Caleb had hesitated for only a second. He needed the money. He always needed the money. His mother, Deanne, was back home in Dillingham, working double shifts at the cannery to keep the lights on. She had a bad knee and a worse landlord, and every paycheck Caleb sent home meant one less thing she had to worry about. So he nodded, threw his gear bag over his shoulder, and climbed aboard the Irene Marie without a second thought. He didn't call his mother before they left the dock. That would eat at him later more than almost anything else. The Irene Marie was a 62-foot commercial fishing vessel, old but reliable, captained by a man named Roy Callahan who had spent 30 years on Alaskan waters and trusted the sea the way most people trust gravity. Roy had a crew of 5, including Caleb, and he ran a tight, professional operation. Nobody on that boat was careless. Nobody was reckless. And yet, the storm came from the northwest on the 3rd day out. The forecast had shown rough conditions, elevated swells, 30-knot winds, nothing a vessel like the Irene Marie hadn't handled before. But weather in the Gulf of Alaska is a living thing, and living things don't always behave the way models predict. By mid-afternoon, the swells had climbed to 20 feet. By evening, 30, the radio crackled with warnings that were arriving too late to be useful. Roy ordered the crew below deck. Caleb was the last one heading for the hatch when the wave hit. Later, the Coast Guard would classify it as a rogue wave, a wall of water, nearly feet tall that appeared without warning and struck the Irene Marie on her port side with the force of a freight train. The vessel rolled hard. Caleb felt the world tilt sideways, and then he was falling. And then it was cold. A cold so absolute and so violent that for a moment his brain simply refused to process it as real. The water temperature in the Gulf of Alaska in late September is just above freezing. He surfaced, gasping, swallowing air and salt water in equal measure, grabbing blindly for anything solid. His hand found a rope. The rope was attached to a life raft, an emergency inflatable that had deployed. Automatically, when the ship rolled, he pulled himself toward it with arms that were already going numb, hauled himself over the edge, and collapsed face down onto the orange rubber floor, shaking so hard his teeth cracked together. When he lifted his head and looked back, the Irene Marie was gone. There are moments in a person's life that split time into before and after. Caleb lay on the floor of that life raft as the storm raged around him and understood, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that everything that had existed before this moment, the dock, the foreman's voice, the smell of his gear bag, the last cup of coffee he'd drunk that morning without thinking, all of it was now on the other side of an invisible wall he could never cross back through. He was alone. The raft was equipped with a basic emergency kit, a small hand pump, a sealed container of water rations, 6 protein bars, a signal mirror, a waterproof flashlight, and a handheld flare gun with 4 cartridges. There was also a small hand-operated radio beacon, an EPIRB, that he activated immediately, pressing the button and watching the small red light begin to blink. Help was coming. He told himself that help was always coming if the beacon was working. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the beacon had been damaged during the capsizing. Its signal was transmitting, but on a degraded frequency, bouncing off a satellite at irregular intervals. The Coast Guard would receive fragments. They would search, but the search area would be wrong. Caleb spent the first night on his knees, bailing water from the raft with his cupped hands as waves crashed over the sides. He didn't sleep. He didn't stop moving. Movement meant warmth, and warmth meant survival, and survival was the only thought his mind was capable of holding. By morning, the storm had passed. The ocean around him was enormous and gray and completely, impossibly empty. On the second day, when the initial shock began to settle into something colder and more permanent, Caleb reached into the inner pocket of his survival suit and found the one thing he hadn't known he was carrying, a photograph. His mother had slipped it into his gear bag before his first ever fishing trip. 2 years earlier, he'd meant to take it out 100 times. He never had. It had traveled with him on every run since then, forgotten and unexamined, tucked beneath layers of waterproof nylon. He unfolded it carefully with numb fingers. It was a photo of the two of them, Diane and Caleb, standing in front of their house in Dillingham. On the day he graduated high school, his mother was laughing at something just outside the frame. She was wearing a yellow sweater. She looked, in that moment, exactly the way she always looked when she thought no one was watching her. Completely, quietly happy, Caleb stared at that photograph for a long time. Then he folded it back up, put it against his chest, inside his suit, as close to his heart as it would go, and he made a decision. He was going home. Not maybe. Not if the beacon worked, or if a ship passed, or if the weather held. He was going home. That wasn't hope. Hope is something you hold loosely, something that can be taken. This was something else. Something harder and heavier and far more stubborn. This was a promise. The days that followed would become, in Caleb's memory, a single long blur of cold and hunger and physical effort, broken by occasional bursts of raw terror. He rationed his water carefully, 2 small sips in the morning, 2 at night, and collected rainwater whenever he could, using the raft's rubber canopy as a funnel. The protein bars he stretched across 12 days, cutting each one into thirds with a small folding knife from the kit, eating slowly, chewing every bite until there was nothing left. He caught fish. That surprised him. On the 4th day, he found a short length of fishing, lying coiled in the bottom of the kit, along with 2 small hooks. He had no bait, so he used a strip of silver foil from a protein bar wrapper, dangling it just below the surface until the light caught it and the fish came. They weren't big. Sometimes they were barely a mouthful, but they were calories, and calories were time, and time was the only currency that mattered now. He fired one of his 4 flares on day 6, when he spotted what looked like a vessel on the horizon. The shape disappeared before he could be sure. He would not fire another flare until he was certain. That kind of discipline, the ability to hold back, to wait, to not react from panic, was something Roy Callahan had talked about on the boat during a storm drill the first day. Caleb hadn't been paying full attention. Now he replayed every word the man had said as if each one was a piece of firewood he could burn to stay warm. He thought about Roy often. He thought about the rest of the crew, men whose last names he'd barely learned. He hoped they had made it. He told himself they had. He needed to believe that at least some of them had found their way back. The physical toll was relentless. By the end of the 2nd week, his body had begun consuming itself. His face, when he caught his reflection in the signal mirror, was hollowed out, sharp-boned, the skin around his eyes dark as bruises. His hands were a landscape of cracks and salt sores. His lips bled constantly from the cold and the wind. But he was still thinking clearly. That mattered more than anything. On day 15, a Coast Guard C-130 passed overhead close enough that he could hear the engine. He grabbed the signal mirror and angled it toward the sun, throwing light in every direction, holding it steady for as long as his arm would allow. The plane did not circle back. He did not fire a flare. He put the mirror down and breathed. He looked at the photograph. He kept going. Day 20 arrived like a verdict. The water rations were gone. The fish had moved or dispersed, or simply become too smart for his silver foil trick. He hadn't eaten in 4 days, and hadn't had clean water in 2. His body had crossed some invisible threshold, and he could feel it. Not as pain, exactly, but as a kind of dimming, like a light slowly being turned down. He began to talk out loud. At first, it was practical, narrating his tasks, reminding himself what to do next. But by the 2nd night, he was talking to his mother, not hallucinating, not delusional, just talking, telling her about the color of the water at sunrise, telling her he was sorry he hadn't called before the boat left, telling her about the fish he'd caught and the flare he'd almost wasted, and the way the stars out here, with no land and no light pollution for hundreds of miles in every direction, were so thick and so bright that on clear nights they felt close enough to touch. He told her he was keeping his promise. On day 21, it rained. He spread his arms wide and tilted his face up and collected every drop he could, filling the small rubber reservoir he'd fashioned from a piece of the raft's inner lining. He drank until his stomach ached. He cried, not from sadness, but from something more complicated than that, something that had relief and gratitude and loneliness and determination all mixed together in a way language isn't quite built to describe. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand and kept going. On the morning of the 32nd day, Caleb Marsh woke from a light, dangerous sleep to a sound he hadn't heard in over a month. An engine. He was upright before his eyes were fully open, grabbing the flare gun with hands that shook so badly he had to grip it in both fists. He looked toward the horizon and saw it. Not a shimmer, not a maybe, but a real vessel, a crab boat, moving on a course that would bring it within half a mile of his position if it held steady. He had 2 flares left. He waited. He let the boat get closer. Closer. His whole body was screaming at him to fire. Every nerve he had left demanding action. But he waited the way Roy had said to wait, the way discipline demanded, until the vessel was close enough that a flare couldn't possibly be missed. Then he fired. The red light arced into the morning sky and hung there, burning. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the crab boat changed course. Caleb Marsh was airlifted to a hospital in Anchorage suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and hypothermia. He had lost 31 pounds. 3 of his fingers had frostbite damage that would take months of treatment. His immune system was compromised and his heart showed minor stress indicators that doctors would monitor for a year. He was alive. Of the Irene Marie's crew, 2 others survived, Roy Callahan and a deckhand named Pete Okafor, who had been rescued in the first 48 hours by a passing tanker. The other 2 men were never found. Caleb would carry that with him always. His mother flew to Anchorage the day after he was found. She walked into his hospital room and stopped in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Caleb reached into the front pocket of the hospital gown they'd put him in and took out the photograph. One of the 2 of them, the yellow sweater. The laugh caught just before the camera clicked and held it up. Diane crossed the room and took it from his hand and held it against her chest. She sat beside his bed and took his damaged, salt-scarred hand in both of hers, and she didn't let go. Outside the hospital window, Anchorage was cold and gray and ordinary. It was the most beautiful thing Caleb Marsh had ever seen. 32 days, 1 photograph, 1 promise he refused to break.